Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you for joining our For Growers by Growers webinar today. I'm Robert Ford. I work with growers and customers across Western North America, US and Canada. Heliospectra was founded in 2006 in Sweden by plant scientists and biologists with one vision: to make crop production more intelligent and resource efficient. Today, with customers across 6 continents, Heliospectra is a global leader in innovative horticultural lighting, custom light control systems, and specialized services for greenhouses, vertical farms, and controlled plant growth environments. At Heliospectra, our mission is to define nature's potential through innovation, technology, and meaningful partnerships. Our commitment delivers operational excellence for our growers and their businesses. Thank you for joining us today to share best practices and talk about cultivation techniques. I'd like to highlight a few housekeeping items before starting today's program. First, please enter your questions or comments in the chat box. We have allocated about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar to discuss your questions. If we do run out of time, one of our presenters will reach out to you directly by email. We have a lot, number 2, we have a lot of webinars planned, so please register for upcoming topics that may be of interest. A link will be provided in a follow-up email along with the recorded version of this webinar. And also, lastly, please follow us on social media and continue the discussions with us on this topic in future webinars. Now I'd like to introduce Matthew Dent. He's been working as a technical specialist in high-tech horticulture with Royal Brinkmann. Matthew has spent the last few years assisting Australian cannabis startups with their equipment and consumables. Most recently, Matthew has worked on establishing Royal Brinkmann's new dedicated cannabis cultivation website called CanHub. Be sure to check it out, www.canhub, or sorry, can-hub.com for more information. And with that, Matthew will intro the rest of the team.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate Heliospectra having myself be part of the webinar today. Super duper excited about the conversation and banter that's going to come off the back of this. We're obviously going to have a lot of fun. We're going to shed light on a lot of grey areas, and yeah, it's going to be really cool. First of all, I'd like to introduce Tim, Emily, and Ryan. Tim, can I throw over to you and get you to tell us a little bit about yourself, please, mate?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Matt. My name is Tim Oates. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Delta Tetra Consultancy. Delta Tetra has been operational for about 4 years in the Australian space, predominantly supporting groups through regulatory compliance and developing license applications on behalf of a number of groups across Australia. We specialize in supporting groups in developing standard operating procedure, quality assurance and management systems, and basically getting all of the fun paperwork in order for them to be able to get licenses and become operational. So we have been fortuitous to have been able to experience a number of different compliance related scenarios, specifically dealing with regulators on a day-to-day basis. So that we'll be discussing these things today will be within the context of dealing with regulators and understanding how compliance and operations come together in that regard.
Awesome, thanks, Tim. Emily, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. So Emily Rigby, based on the Sunshine Coast in Southeast Queensland in Australia, working for Cannabis as Director of Research and Compliance. I've been working in the field of medical cannabis since legislative changes came into effect in 2016. So it's been a fun ride, starting off as a consultant and then going full-time with Cannabis and really being involved from startup at all levels. So I've had the joy, like Tim, of navigating the Office of Drug Control, all the hoops you have to jump through, all the way through to cultivation, harvest, market access, and of course, this fun landscape of GACP and GMP. But yeah, really a great industry to be a part of. Sort of became a bit of an advocate for the industry, which was definitely not my intention when I came into cannabis. I really just wanted to grow this magnificent plant, and now involved on all levels, but it's a really exciting industry to be a part of. So happy to share some of my insights with you all today.
Awesome, thanks Emily. Last but not least, Ryan.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Hola, hey, bonjour, aloha. Thanks for joining us today. I am working with Heliospectra as the cannabis grower liaison. I'm a second-generation cannabis grower who worked and ran a couple of facilities in the Denver area from 2009 to 2015. During that time, worked with a great team and accumulated a couple of High Times awards, which was great. And I'm very stoked and happy to be here with all of the panelists and speakers, and really happy to see how far we get into this conversation. So thanks.
Awesome, thanks Ryan. Okay, I guess I'll start by trying to show my screen. I'll just give everyone a bit of an introduction and do a bit of housekeeping. So can everyone see my screen now? Yep. Okay, cool. So just want to bring a little bit of attention to GACP and GMP in cultivation today. So, you know, looking at the slide we see here, you know, you can clearly see we've got some farmers in the field in Tasmania, Australia, and they're cultivating poppies for opioid production. Fast forward to the GMP side of things in that slide, and you can see, you know, the big difference in how it's approached and the sort of, I guess, safety measures and hygiene measures around that kind of production. So when we talk about GACP and GMP, you know, they're kind of worlds apart in other industries, and if anything, I think that the cannabis industry is already, you know, when you talk about wildcrafting and foraging and other things like that, cannabis is already, you know, streets ahead in that aspect. Of course, you know, there's a lot of education and a lot to learn still. I'll just fast forward to the next slide. So when we talk about, I'll just get that right. So when we talk about good agricultural and collection practices, GACP was developed by the World Health Organization in 2003. This was a reaction to substandard herbal medicines entering the market, and as a result, GACP was introduced as a way to ensure product safety for consumers. GACP covers a broad range of activities, like I said, including wildcrafting. When we refer to GMP in this webinar, we will be referring to the PICS Guide to GMP. PICS, Good Manufacturing Practice, was derived from the original World Health Organization GMP guidelines. In 1989, the EU adopted its own set of guidelines. It's important to point out that they are practically identical in a lot of ways. And when you have a look at the map there, the PICS Guide to GMP, you know, practically covers a lot of the important cannabis cultivation that's happening in the world already. And, you know, Tim will be able to jump in and talk more to that. But, yeah, just want to make sure we're on the right page. Everything we're talking about here is from a cultivation point of view. And we want to make sure that everyone knows that, you know, it's important to take the advice here today, but also make sure you clarify with your local regulators. Speak to a company like Tim's in Delta Tetra. Make sure you tick all the boxes, you know, because there's a lot to consider, and hopefully today we can shed light on a lot of it. Cool, Tim. Do you want to get the ball rolling? I'll just stop sharing here.
Happily, I absolutely love going first in all things. Okay, so bear with me a second here. I'm going to do my best very quickly to get this screen up for you. If you guys could do me the favor of telling me if you can see it. Okay, I'm going to assume that that's now up. up and running. Okay, lovely. So as mentioned, Delta Tetra is a company that I founded and have been working for a number of years now. We are essentially, at its nuts and bolts, compliance firm, supporting groups specifically with cannabis related operations. And so what that means is bringing together very strenuous and rigorous pharmaceutical regulations that we have had set in place here in Australia with practical operational experience related to cannabis as a discipline. And so we have been working very hard over the period of that time to be able to not only bring together those firm standards, but also the operational procedures that run alongside them. So our core business is supporting compliance in groups, both very large and publicly funded, all the way down to the individual that just has a passion for growing cannabis, with the view to be able to get them to a point of being operational. As a consequence of the success of the license applications that we've submitted over that period of 4 years, we've begun playing an increasing role in not only the compliance and ongoing compliance, but also the commercialization of those businesses. So supporting them not only through the licensing, but then getting to a point where they are functional and able to make money, which is essentially what all these businesses are looking to try and do. And so that's left us in a very advantageous position in terms of the view that we get of regulatory compliance and the work that needs to be done around it. And so we're going to talk about some of those things today, as Matt mentioned, specifically to the cultivation of cannabis. So GMP and cannabis cultivation, it's something that's thrown around a lot in terms of conversation and on pitch decks, and we hear lots of lovely conversations around it at expos and various panel discussions like this. But what does it actually mean? Is it an important compliance standard specifically relevant to cannabis, or is it an unattainable misunderstanding at best, or at worst potential gimmick? GMP was developed as a control system, as a certification system for industries with consumable products. So everything from food to cosmetics to precision pharmaceuticals. The point of GMP is to put in place a number of quality control systems, standard operating procedure, risk management systems, to essentially control every variable associated with a particular set of operations. So in the pharmaceutical industry, you can imagine why that might be important. And so if we're discussing cannabis as it's currently regulated in Australia, which is effectively a pharmaceutical, this is relevant to that. Now, the challenge with GMP is that it typically relates to, as I say, precision elements. So when you're working with pharmaceuticals, you're getting down to the fundamental compounds that a medicine is required to have within it, in a completely controllable dose form, in a completely controllable final delivery format. And that works exceptionally well and has done in terms of protecting people's health and the integrity of the products. But how did GMP become relevant to cannabis? Something that isn't quite as controllable as we might like and has a number of different variables associated with it. Well, that comes principally down to how cannabis has been regulated. And so in Australia and increasingly around the world, THC is regulated as a strict pharmaceutical product and often sits in the same bracket as opioids, etc. And so it was reasonable to assume perhaps that that GMP would be relevant to cannabis. Additionally, the challenge with it is that that Emily will talk about more completely later on. And so GMP being applied for the entire life cycle of that process is arduous and challenging, to say the least. And so what we've had to battle with is how do we meet those GMP standards? Where do they come into effect? How do they impact the operation of a facility? And is it an attainable certification system that can be maintained, auditable, and operational at the same time? And people have a different viewpoint in this depending on where they're coming from. Increasingly, we've seen companies suggesting that they have GMP cultivation facilities and so on and so forth. And now what that means is that they have essentially got to a point where they're controlling every little thing within that facility. A good example that we use to illustrate the level of detail that's required for a GMP certification on an operational facility is something as simple as say the fans in the cultivation space. And so if you're going to have rotary fans sitting above the canopy and able to increase air movement, you have to have procedural documents, IQ, OQ systems, which are qualification systems, to be able to explain and lead the operation of taking those fans apart, cleaning them, putting them back together again. All of that needs to be governed under your standard operating procedure relevant to GMP. So literally everything is controlled in that variable.
Tim, can I just jump in there quickly? I'd like to open up the floor to Ryan and Emily as well.
Yeah,
from a cultivator's point of view, guys, GMP, you know, I was reading up on GMP, and, you know, a couple of jokes were around about GMP standing for get more paper, get more people. From a cultivation point of view, if you did have to document every time you turned a fan on, for example, how do you guys see that affecting your day-to-day operation as a cultivator? Like, you know, what's acceptable and what's going a little bit too far from where you guys see it?
It's a difficult question, but a really good one, Tim. And I'm Matt, sorry, and I'm sure that's what a lot of people are interested in. And personally, at Cannatrek, we are not going down the path of GMP cultivation. I think it is almost unachievable, and it really depends on the facility that you have. But I think, you know, trying to have GMP cultivation, in my personal opinion, is going a little bit too far, considering how heavily regulated the industry is. But if you are interested in pursuing GACP, even for cultivation, there is so much documentation, even for GACP. And I really think it's actually a best practice that we should all be aspiring to anyway. But I do think, you know, GMP is probably taking the cultivation side a little bit too far. But either way, we want to produce a reproducible, high quality, consistent product all year round. And in order to do that, you fortunately or unfortunately need a lot of documentation and to be really strict in your protocols and procedures in order to achieve that.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, and the thing that I can add is where the question, and there's so much kind of grayness surrounding the area with whether somebody goes for GMP versus GACP, I think can also be market driven on where their product, if they are looking for export in regions or of actual local production and keeping it within that's where it really starts to, you see some markets starting to be more driven toward GACP when a lot of the interactions in the facilities I run into in Europe are all operating under this, you know, GMP standard of cultivation. And I think it does go too far. I think that from my personal aspect on the GMP, I think that there is a lot of necessary things that should be done when it comes to even GACP and documentation. That always just increases the quality of your product anyways, as a grower. As you kind of mentioned at the beginning, that a lot of the cultivation facilities are kind of already ahead of a GACP production.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I see when I look at some of those facilities in the US, facilities like Emily's, I see, a level of cleanliness that we don't see in other areas of horticulture. And when you look at the World Health Organization guidelines and what they were brought in to achieve, I certainly think that, if you're aiming to win a cannabis cup or, provide medicine for your patients at the highest level, then I think the cannabis industry is already in a good place, because the plant dictates a lot of those requirements, and the level of attention you guys are giving the plants already is world class in my opinion. Sorry, Tim, do you want to continue? I'm sorry to throw a spanner in the works.
No, not at all. The conversation is a good one, and I'm going to try and touch on some of those things a little bit now. And as Emily said, you know, and Ryan, GMP does, in my opinion, go a little bit too far in terms of the controls that need to be in place, but it does have a role to play. And so the conversation that is very interesting at the moment in cannabis is, where does sort of GACP come into effect and end, and where does GMP begin? And so, you know, there are elements of GMP that are required in a cultivation facility. Now, as we discussed, GACP is a more flexible regulatory or certification system that allows for the variables of a cultivation space. And so some of the challenges that you can find, you know, not having that flexibility is if you were to have an area of negative air pressure in a GMP qualified cultivation space that whipped up some of your substrate or medium or cocoa coir or what have you into the flower canopy, that whole crop is essentially unusable. Whereas GACP has more flexibilities built into it innately to be able to allow for some of those variables in a cultivation space. So you can run GACP all the way through essentially to harvest and begin implementing GMP processes and procedures shortly thereafter. And so everything, say for example, from the harvest point onward, can be governed by GMP procedures. And now that's everything from your drying and curing, the controls that are put in place around that, and then the packaging and labeling of those products as well. And so what that means is that you can have a blend of both certification systems, but the challenge is, how do you implement those things? And so what we look to try and do with our groups, and what I'm sure Emily will explain that they've done over there is at Cannatrek, is to implement GACP to not only ensure the quality of the product, but also to allow the flexibility of them to actually run the facility, but also to allow them to be accountable and auditable. So these certification systems are not just there to be a hindrance, they're genuinely there to control the quality of the product that's meant to come out in the other end. And if there is a lack of control or a misstep that's taken place, there are procedures, etc., there to be able to not only allow for the recall of that product, but also to do a preliminary or an investigation, if you like, looking into where those problems occurred and how best to control them next time. And so what we're really looking to try and do with cannabis is to understand that these certification systems are there to protect both the user and the cultivator or the manufacturer, but also to allow for the progression and development of the quality of the material that's within them. And one thing that we were discussing very briefly before we came live on the webinar here was, you know, these certification systems are there to add a fundamental baseline of quality. What should you be looking to try and achieve as a minimum to be able to operate? But that doesn't mean to say that will guarantee the quality that you're looking for or your market is looking for. And so what it becomes a case of is looking at these certification systems and making them flexible to work for yourselves. So, you know, Ryan, for example, or Emily or myself may have a particular cultivation method that we have an affinity to. And so we might develop a number of standard operating procedures, forms and policies to be able to govern that particular operation. And those procedures are then what goes into making your pack or your application for a certification system. And so everybody needs to understand that these certification systems are not rigid in the sense that they apply the same way to every operation at every event or every turn. But in fact, that you should be looking to take the procedures or the understandings that have come from cannabis industries prior and implement that into control systems that are then allow for the quality management of those products. I'm sure that makes perfect sense for people who are listening to this for the first time, but we can get into the nitty-gritty of that when we move through the questions.
Yeah, I think it's
of those certifications. Oh, go ahead, Ryan, please.
No, I was just saying those are all good points, and relative to even with you know, contamination. You talked about fans and possibly blowing from soil up into contaminating, you know, your end product, which should potentially be getting thrown away. And I think that's and you also mentioned that growers really just need to be really implementing and taking the things that we're already doing. I mean, with contamination tests and specifically in specific regions, you're already getting, you know, tested for any, usually these microbial activity within on your plant, and you're, you know, if you do, for instance, an example, we had issues, or growers would have issues with soil gardens, particularly harvest time, when they're harvesting their plants, stacking pots up, which then sprays the dust up into the air, which would then contaminate the flower. And just that kind of procedure of, all right, you're already implementing some procedure that you have to find where's that contamination happening, and then really just document it. You're letting your growers know that this is, potentially a risk area. And I think quality risk management is really important in all of the process.
I'm glad you got that. That's exactly right. I felt like there was a little bit of lost in the moment there, so I'm glad that that came across. But you're entirely right, and it would be interesting for groups, like Canatrek with Emily, and how they're going to pull that experience into those certification systems.
Spot on. Okay, Tim, do you have more to run with, or should we throw over to Emily?
No, at the risk of boring everybody to tears, I think that will be it for the day.
Well said, Tim, and I think you highlighted some good points there. Emily, do you want to begin?
Awesome. Let me just bring this up. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So I'm really just going to touch on a little bit. I won't go into so much what is GACP and GMP, because I think Tim's done a pretty good job on that. I'm going to talk from my perspective, how I see GACP and GMP relevant to cannabis, and specifically looking at our experience with Canatrek, and when and where does this actually apply to your business. And I do just, I'm going to finish off with giving you some advice from my experience, but I do want to really mention, that this is my personal viewpoint and from our personal experience cultivating in Australia and our prospective markets that we want to get access into. And so I do strongly suggest that you seek, professional advice to make sure that you've got the correct information for your business model. So really, again, Tim sort of touched on GACP and GMP, but really what I want to reiterate here is that it's actually best practice. So it's not something that you should necessarily look at as a hindrance, but as a baseline, for good quality, consistent production. Because what these two frameworks really give us are guidelines in order for us to standardize and control consistent cannabis production. And this is really critical because all of the steps in production and primary processing, considering the cultivation side, all of these have a direct influence on the quality of the cannabis, and whether that's as cannabis flower as the finished product or whether it's then sent for extraction. So it's really critical that we establish these quality standards to ensure consumer safety and a consistent product. And fortunately or unfortunately, this requires a high level of documentation. At Canatrek, we have close to 200 documents that cover our GACP and GMP processes. And as Tim mentioned, this is really market driven. So it's really important to consider what markets you want access to and when and where GACP and GMP become relevant for your business. So when we're talking specifically with cannabis, and I'm going to focus more on the cultivation side, and which is where we're implementing GACP, it's, the cultivation process is complex. There's many different variables in the growing environment, and we need to make sure that we've got a reproducible starting material so that every time we grow that particular chemovar, it's standardized all the way through so that we have a consistent product for our downstream partners or our patients every single time. So we need a quality assurance system in order to achieve this. And so we really need, to start, you need to identify your critical production steps. So looking at a bit of a roadmap of your business, and then writing strict protocols and procedures around all of these production steps. And what this means is, it's really a risk management system, a quality assurance system that ensures that you've got no adverse effects during all of those processes. And whether you go all the way from cultivation through manufacture, to the patient, or whether you're just concerned with cultivation, we need to make sure that we have these strict procedures in place that are all documented. So, yeah, the joys of standard operating procedures, record keeping, traceability, all of this is really critical so that we can have a consistent, high quality product to bring to market.
Emily, can I just jump in there real quickly? I can see you've put up the table there, which is really cool. But I just wanted to quickly touch on in regards to the processing side of cannabis and moving that API from from a raw botanical product to a GMP pharmaceutical grade end product. And again, the table speaks to that. But I wanted to ask you guys what your thoughts are about third-party processing and the role that third-party processors play within the industry, so that some cultivators, for example, may not want to go down the whole GMP road and can use a third party. Do you guys have anything to add on that side of things?
Yeah, I think I'd probably just mention, I think particularly in Australia, there are, there's a lot of people that plan on cultivating but not manufacturing, and therefore, depending on what markets they're trying to get into or who their downstream partners are, they would be looking into perhaps GACP only, depending. It's really critical with all of your downstream partners, that you have really clear levels of communication and understanding of what the expectations are for you as a cultivator and for them as your manufacturer downstream. I think the model that they're proposing for New Zealand, they're actually not going to allow vertical integration. I think is one of the items in the bill that they're putting forward. So they won't actually allow growers in New Zealand if this is passed. I believe you won't be able to actually have that full vertical integration where you're cultivating all the way through to manufacture. So I think it really depends. I think there's some great companies in Australia and around the world that are focusing purely on cultivation, and others that are focusing, more purely on the processing and manufacturing side. So I think it's, there's a lot of potential for these partnerships, and it of course makes it easier for investments. If you're thinking about the capital, to build a state-of-the-art greenhouse or glass house, and then actually building a GMP facility. So that's a lot of upfront capital costs. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to specialize either in cultivation or manufacture, and actually have some really great relationships there to bring product to market quicker.
Yeah, well said. I agree with that. I think as a business, you've got to stick to what you're good at, and there's a few businesses out there that can probably pull it off and are pulling it all off. But, from my point of view, I think it's important that everybody knows that you can do one or the other also. Please continue, yeah, Emily. Sorry to jump in there again.
No, well, this is probably maybe the boring slide when we get into this table from the PICS guide. As I mentioned before, GACP is really more, in our experience, we're looking at GACP for cultivation, harvest, and primary processing, and then GMP when it comes to manufacture, some of our other processing steps, packaging and storage. And really what you're looking at, and this is from the PICS guide, is these central areas here where we're talking about APIs extracted from plant sources, herbal extracts used as API, and then API from milled herbs. And so you can see as we move from left to right, we've got the increasing GMP requirements. But from our experience and talking to a variety of different GMP consultants over the last 4 years, we've definitely got different interpretations of the PICS guide when it comes to cannabis. So I think it is really important, that you seek professional advice and maybe even seek more than one person's opinion, because that's definitely something we've been told multiple times, and Tim mentioned before, there's a lot of gray areas. It's open to interpretation, even requesting advice, seeking guidance from the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia. Even they're not always clear with their guidance. So unfortunately, a lot is open to interpretation, and that's where it's really critical that you actually have clear communications and agreements with your downstream partners, whether that's the markets that you're accessing, or perhaps your third-party manufacturer, to ensure that you're meeting everybody's expectations to have that market access. And that's where, you know, I really drill home that it is market driven. You know, if Cannatrek simply want to provide to the Australian domestic market, then that has different implications for us, as opposed to if we want to be able to export into Germany, for example. So we really need to consider that. And so it's critical to plan ahead. This has implications for so many things when it comes to your facility design, the construction, the layout, selection of equipment, the equipment design, how are you going to clean that equipment, how is it going to be installed, how will it be operated, your personnel, hygiene is critical. All of your processes and procedures need to meet these standards in order for you to access the markets that you're intending to and the formulations that you want to make. So I think, you know, when we're talking about GACP and GMP, it really is a quality management system. It assures best practice. It covers so many different aspects, not just of cultivation. As I mentioned, you know, your facility design, selection of equipment, your processes, all your documentation, everything from cultivation, your inputs, your selection of genetic material, your media, your fertilizers, then your processes through harvesting, drying, curing, your trimming, your bucking, your packaging, your labeling. The list just goes on, and it's making sure that you have all these systems and processes documented. As I mentioned before, we have close to 200 documents. These are just some of the areas that our documents cover. You know, so all of those processes along the way when it comes to operations, but also when you're looking at your quality assurance. So there is a lot of work to be done, and it's great that there's companies like Delta Tetra with, you know, where Tim and his team can actually assist you, because it is, you know, unless documents are your thing, I'm a plant person, so documentation is definitely not where I want to spend my time. So it's good to make sure that you get that right at the start. So I guess my advice moving forward is be prepared, plan ahead. Project management is critical. So, you know, get your business model up, work out what areas are going to be relevant, is GACP and or GMP going to be relevant to you. You need to consider your market access, your formulations, because that all has implications for where GACP and GMP is relevant. You need to incorporate this really early on into your facility design, your equipment, your documentation. Cannabis already is a heavily regulated industry, so I think there's a great opportunity to actually incorporate this early on in all of your documentation. And it's really something that you need to be working towards as a baseline. This really is best practice. So your good agricultural and collection practices and your good manufacturing practices are really a baseline that even if you want to be certified by a third party or not, these are really standards that you should be aiming for anyway, so that we can produce quality, consistent cannabis flower all year round. And so I do strongly suggest, you know, that you get different opinions, you educate yourself, you engage third parties and get professional advice and certification, and really use these standards as guidelines, as a basis for your facilities. And instead of seeing them as a hindrance, they're actually, you know, your key to produce high quality cannabis year round and have access to all the different markets with a variety of different formulations now and into the future.
Well said, Emily. And I think that slide, you know, tells a beautiful story, and is probably one that I'm sure people are screenshotting right now to make sure that that they tick all of those boxes, because I think, yeah, that's a good recipe. Ryan, do you want to boot this baby home?
Yeah, I will. I think there's probably going to be some really good Q&A, so I will like to you know, touch on a couple things. I think I'm just going to pull up my slides here, so hopefully everybody can see those. Awesome. So I just really wanted to touch we've talked about the really importance of equipment selection, and I think with from equipment selection, really for myself particularly, even goes hand in hand with, you know, creating those standard operating procedures that your team can work on, and also works hand in hand with the quality of product. That I think that depending on what your market is, a lot of the processors and a lot of the growers, all around the world are already heading towards that of producing a really consistent product. So, I'd first like to say and agree with everybody is seeking professional advice. Multiple sources is always good, and also looking for market-driven decisions when it goes to if you are going to be producing GACP or versus GMP, or seeking that third party. Personally, I see a lot of back and forth where, I think that quality risk management from even in equipment, but also whether you are vertically integrated is important. Whatever step that you choose needs to be well documented and processes in between those lines. So from at least a lighting equipment and equipment standpoint, and I think a big confusion into the industry is there is no list of certified equipment, at least that I have started to see. I think that when you start to see that from a manufacturer's point of view, it's whether that product is being used in that space dictates whether usually sometimes that product can be used. So a few important points when it comes to equipment that you need to be taking into consideration, of course, is a sanitary design of product. So it shouldn't be porous, free from any really chemical resistance. Cleaning, as we've mentioned a bunch of times on all of the processes, that cleaning is a very important part. Not only is it an important part, but it also needs to be documented. That processes of taking it apart, what you're cleaning it with, and actually then installing it back up. So all of those important factors are really important when it comes to choosing a product. And some of these points might be related more with lighting, but I think it can work hand in hand with other equipment that you might have along the facility, from dehumidifiers to your trimming or bucking processes, all the way up and down. Also critical components are also need to be consistently operating. So from a cultivation standpoint, of course, I'm looking for a product that's running really with longevity, and really producing a consistent product is very important in all of this process, whether it has to be a consistent cannabinoid profile or a terpene, and also your equipment is working hand in hand in those sort of factors. So having inconsistent environmental controls can potentially always lead to inconsistent quality of product. So I always suggest with growers going with redundancy. It is never a bad option in any of these processes and steps. So also appropriate design to facilitate operations for intended use in cleaning. So I think that most important thing about the equipment is that it's cleaning and that it can be documented. So a few of important things that you can look at when it comes to your lighting, and also products that you and also things that you need to be documenting along the way, that your equipment needs to be functioning as it's intended for. So particularly with lighting in general, you can document particularly spectrums or intensity depending on what stage. For instance, if for vegetative, using lower intensities, but also making sure that you are documenting that PPFD through each stage of growth, and that it's also you're also following it. Uniformity also can be an important consideration, which for myself, it comes to both spectrum and uniformity from a cultivation standpoint, really has a lot of driving force when it comes to producing a consistent product. So from a cultivation standpoint, I think that a grower should be looking at these, having a very uniform spectrum, and a spectrum tailored for the crop's particular growth is going to allow you to create very consistent SOPs for fertigation, harvesting times, and so on. So you can really get a lot more consistent growth with a light that provides a little more uniformity. Performance over a time, of course, I think it really is more common sense that it's a factor that you do need to take into consideration. I think that whether you are GACP or GMP, and HPS or versus LED. Those need to be taken into consideration with longevity of quality of that equipment, on how long it's going to last and what that's going to do to the actual product. Easy to clean, IP rating. So higher IP rating might be something that's considered in a really wet environment, or if you're taking with, again, cleaning and your process involves spraying something down or fogging the room with a solution after harvest time to sanitize everything, a high IP rating may need to be considered. And also failure rate. So longevity of equipment is always particularly important when it comes to any sort of equipment design. Redundancy, this could be an extra % or two when it comes to designing your facility. In large facilities, you'll see a 1% particularly, or even higher sometimes with extra equipment or sort of redundancy. If something does fail, that can be replaced fairly quickly. And last, I just wanted to touch on, because I think we're going to have some really good questions that are going to come in. So if you want to check me out, go ahead and follow me at Ross to Grow OG. And of course, vertical grows, we do see a lot of vertical applications that are being used in these processes. So I'm really interested to see what some of the questions are that are coming out of the audience.
Sounds good. It's good handoff from Ryan. Beautiful presentation, folks. Thank you for all of your great insight there. We do have some good questions coming in. First one's for Emily. They say, basically asking about your experience so far with suppliers on gear and consumables regarding the validation of GMP. What's been your biggest difficulty in sourcing materials, capital equipment, or otherwise that meet the standard?
Yeah, okay. Probably the first thing that I would mention, and this is, some of the issues that we had right at the beginning. Obviously, you get really excited that you're going to start cultivating, and people go out and buy equipment and then think about how it fits, or whether it's from, media from suppliers, and then think about how does that fit in afterwards. So as I said, my key advice is to really plan it first. So don't go out and buy equipment and then try and work out whether that is suitable for GMP afterwards. I think there's, particularly in Australia, and I'm sure this is relevant around the world, there are some great, suppliers already set up that supply, GMP garments, for example. And so, you can take a lot of that hard work out first. But it is something, that I think GACP really just encourages you to make sure that all of your suppliers are meeting certain standards. And unfortunately, it can be a little bit tedious to get that validation from those different suppliers. But again, this is where, project management planning ahead really works, in that, you're thinking straight away, is this suitable, whether that's your growing media, your fertilizer, your gloves, your garments that you wear. It's really critical to, seek out suppliers that are already in the space. And then, of course, for those suppliers who maybe, in horticulture are not used to supplying into such a heavily regulated industry, is to really work with them, because a lot of that information on the products is available, or you'll find a lot of your suppliers will want to work with you on that to get that whatever paperwork you need to go with it, because obviously, this is a great new emerging industry, not just in Australia, around the world. So I think you'll find that your suppliers want to work with you to make sure that their products are validated so that they can keep supplying you, for years to come. So I guess just, planning ahead and thinking about it first. And I think Ryan really brought up a critical point is, there is no list of equipment that is GMP compliant, but you've got to work with the different suppliers and look at their manuals and their operating procedures of, how do you pull your trimmer apart to clean it? And that, for example, that, is something that's really important to consider in just how long it can take. So there's a variety of different trimmers on the market. Some of them are going to be easily integrated into GMP processes. Some just will not be capable of doing that. Others will, but it might take you, a couple of hours to pull that machine apart. to actually clean it to the standard you need before you run another batch through it. So critical to think, you might be saving some dollars at the start, and then you might end up having to go buy new equipment because you didn't consider it in the first place, or maybe it's just a lot of labor in operating that machine and cleaning that machine, and you could have spent a little bit extra money and saved hours and hours of time for cleaning, because yeah, the hygiene side is really critical. So yeah, plan ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a good point of with the, finding those partners and manufacturers, of having them providing that kind of material for you of those cleaning procedures and documentation of time of how they can go about cleaning equipment. Because from a cultivation standpoint, it's critical that I should not really have to waste so much time and focus and energy on providing my complete documentations of taking apart equipment or suggested cleaning that should come from manufacturers. So finding that trusted partnership goes a long way.
Yeah, I agree, and I think some advice I would offer from a supplier's point of view, dealing with both manufacturers and customers, is by all means, flick me an email if you want to, but get yourself a list of the basic requirements, so that when you are sourcing equipment, you're looking at things like, is it applicable to the local electrical standards within your country? Is it viable for your business to use that piece of equipment, like Emily said, with the sort of pull down times and put together times? And take into account when you're buying equipment that cannabis is one of the stickiest, muckiest things on earth that just absolutely gets on everything and can gum up the handles on a pair of scissors that you didn't even take into consideration. So it's important to look at it from all angles, and I think that goes a long way.
Sounds good. All right, so planning, obviously critical, and anyone opening up a facility, hopefully they're looking ahead a little bit. But other than that, can you speak to maybe any common pitfalls or expectations that production facilities need to know about as they're approaching the certifications? Obviously, consultancy is great to be able to walk through that, but can you speak to some of the experience people might have coming into this that they might not think about up front?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Look, I think it's important that there is an element of humility when setting up these facilities, or these businesses as a whole, to be frank. What we saw in Australia, and what will increasingly be the case through developing markets like Europe, is that these exercises, as Emily has spoken to, can be long-winded and capitally exhausting. And the types of people that will engage in those projects are not necessarily the type of people who respect 100% where this industry has kind of come from. And so I think what's really, really important is that while you have to hit all of these compliance pieces, while you have to have a commercially viable business model, you have to have a strong management team to be able to hold the project together and move it forward, it's also imperative that you have someone who is from this industry or from this space. And that comes with a little bit of background and heritage. And so, being able to understand the life cycle of cannabis as a plant, being able to understand it as a discipline and how it fits into all of these business models and certification systems is really, really important. One of the things that we see increasingly as a consultancy group is people, they want to hire either skill sets or qualifications or agronomists or botanists, and those people are fantastic, but we always encourage that they understand what the market is, what the product is, where it's come from, how it's gotten where it is, because cannabis hasn't just fallen out of the sky, and we're not recreating but we're applying old systems to new rules. And so understanding where that comes in and fits together is imperative. And so for us as a consultancy company, we didn't want to be a pharmaceutical consultancy company. we're a cannabis consultancy company. We understand cannabis and how it fits together. And you know, I think that's really, really important, not only in the advice that you seek, but also in the team that you build and the business model that you put forward. And there are good examples of that across Australia. And so I think a blending of those two worlds, understanding the quality systems, the commercial viabilities, but also the plant, those are the kind of three pillars that you'll need for a successful business.
Nicely said. Nicely said.
That's what I would suggest anyway, but what do I know?
Okay, we got a few minutes. We got about 5 minutes. Here's one that could get into the weeds a little bit, but hopefully it's something to chew on and could be interesting. So, all right, we see, what do you see, or what do you usually see as the cost of complying with these certifications in cannabis regarding especially your resources and your spend? Does cannabis follow the pharmaceutical rule of thumb of being about 70% of costs? It could be.
I'll speak to the equipment side of things. When I compare cannabis equipment to high-tech horticulture equipment, I think there's a lot more stainless steel and a lot more consideration that goes into design. However, when I look at you know, the prices of a lot of you know, I'm talking about pre-GMP, obviously, so pre-extraction. But when I look at the prices of a lot of trimming equipment, drying equipment, harvest, transport, all of those consumables, you know, I think if you're looking to cultivate to a GACP level with GMP in mind for the future, then realistically the prices are pretty much in line with the rest of the horticulture industry to myself. And so whether you're setting up to grow tomatoes in a high-tech environment or cannabis, I think you really got to add a few extras in terms of lighting, both lighting and blacking out, and then the trimming and drying stage. However, you know, from that point of view, the rest really leads into the hygiene and the time it actually takes to work on the plant itself. And maybe Emily and Ryan can speak to that side of it a bit more.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in, Matt. Yeah, I think one of the things, you know, come from a horticulture background. So one of the things that always surprised me when I first got into, or two things that surprised me when I first got into cannabis is, one, people forget that it starts with a plant. So the plant is king, or she is queen in the case of cannabis. And I think what a lot of people actually forget is, you know, that's where it all comes back to. And it's sort of, you know, Tim touched on it a bit as well. It is important that we remember, you know, that cannabis is really at the center of this. There's a lot of people, you know, and suppliers that, you know, we refer to it as a cannabis tax. Like if you're growing cannabis or tomatoes or roses, you know, the fertilizer is the same. Yes, maybe you tweak the recipe a little bit, but that's what we do in horticulture. Protected cropping across the board, you know, the technology is utilized even in growing tomatoes. So, you know, it's definitely something that with the returns of cannabis, that we should be looking at, you know, incorporating as much of this technology when it comes to protected cropping into our greenhouse production systems. I think, you know, I think there's a great opportunity there, but it is definitely something, as Matt mentioned, you know, to be critical of the hygiene and how you can, you know, how you can clean products, clean your facility, all of, you know, any bins that you're using to transfer. But in saying that, you know, I traveled on a Nuffield scholarship looking at protected cropping, and, you know, some of the levels of hygiene I saw in countries like Costa Rica and places like that, you know, is exactly how we're growing cannabis now. So, you know, it's not unique necessarily when we're talking about, you know, cultivation, where we're just talking about cultivating a different crop, albeit a very special one, and that's got the potential for high returns, per gram. If you're comparing, the cost per kilo of cannabis versus tomatoes, for example, they're really, when you look at it, there's no reason that we shouldn't be investing in all of this technology. But it's really critical to work with good partners who aren't just slapping a cannabis tax on because you're growing weed.
So well said. So well said.
The cannabis tax.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. For anyone in the crowd that's joined us late, I'm Robert Ford, and I would like to thank you for coming out and joining us today on this webinar. Also wanted to thank our wonderful, amazing, super talented presenters today, Matthew, Emily, Tim, and Ryan, for sharing your insights on these certifications. We've got another webinar coming up on the 3rd on the topic of controlling consistency and influencing medicinal plant profiles. So that should be super interesting. You'll get a link in the follow-up email on this one. So other than that, thank you all so very much. I really appreciate you, appreciate your time, and have a beautiful day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Cheers.
Cheers.
See you.